Hi everyone, welcome to Shark Felt. Today we are needle felting a silvertip shark. To start off, I just grabbed some white wool as my base and then grab my largest felting needle and start poking at the wool to shape the body. Then I get into this pattern of rolling the wool up tighter and continuing to poke so that the base is more firm at the center and it's not moving around a ton while I'm trying to work on it in the future. Once the wool has begun to take shape with the larger needle, I switch over to a different one which has two, and they are finer so that I can continue building up that shape and it doesn't take as long since there's two of them. Right now the shark is smaller than I want it to be and too soft for me to add colors and features on later, so I build it up with more wool and just continue poking and building it up. Finally, I switch to my biggest needle felting tool, which has a ton of needles in it, just to speed things along. Now that the base is firm enough, we can begin to add color. Now I can take my large tuft of gray wool and start ripping it apart and making it smaller so that I can put it on the body with a finer tipped needle. I continue to add smaller patches of gray wool all the way from the snout to like the base of the tail until it is completely covered in gray from the top, leaving a little white on the underbelly. With the coloring of the body complete, we can now start adding fins to it. Similar to before, I get out my gray tuft of wool and start ripping it apart, and then put the wool on my needle felting mat right behind the body of the shark so that I can start poking out a shape of the tail. I do this just to freehand the proportions of the tail in relation to the body so that the tail isn't too big or too small. Right now the tail is too thin for me to work with properly, so I'm adding more on top just to bulk it out and give it more shape so that it's easier to work on later. One of my favorite things about needle felting actually is that it's an additive art instead of a reductive one, because if you start small you can just keep adding and adding until it's good, so it leaves a lot of room for error, which is really nice. Now that the base of the tail is done, I can get out my brighter white wool and start working on the details of the tail. So the species of shark that I'm working on, which is Silvertip, have this white outline on the edge of their fins, and that's what I'm trying to accomplish right now with just the tail. We'll get to the other fins later. This was definitely the most difficult part of the entire process because you're working with such a thin strip of wool, so it doesn't really want to stick to the base of the wool you're working with, so you just have to keep poking and then hope you don't poke through to the other side where the white isn't supposed to be. Anyways, it was a whole thing, but I got it done. Now that the base of the tail is done with the white edge, I can start adding on the little hook that silvertips have at the very top of their tail. I will do this by taking that brighter white wool again and then making a tiny triangle which I can then needle fill onto the top of the tail. Once that's complete, I wanted to make it more of a gradient instead of like a sharp edge, so I added more white wool on top just to smoothen it out a little. I do flip the tail over and add it to the other side too, I just don't show it because I don't think it's necessary, since it's the same thing, just the other side. Once that's done, I grab my dark brown wool and rip it up and then start putting it on the tail. This will create that gradient effect they have, how it's like darker at the top and then it gets lighter as it goes to the base. Then I do the exact same thing, but instead of at the top, this time it's at the bottom, again continuing to do it on both sides. Once the tail is fully complete, I grab my gray wool once again to create the like arm fins, I guess you would call it, of the Silvertip, and begin making those. I do the same thing before as with the tail by marking a little outline with the needle and then making sure that it is proportional with the body. Just did my research and found out they're called pectoral fins, so now that we have those, we can flip them over and then I can needle felt in the white underside that they have. I do this by switching to my finer two-pronged needle felt tool and then gently needle felting the surface of the gray with the white, because if I push too deep, the white will show up on the other side of the fin, showing white speckles on top, which they don't have, so I just have to be careful about that. Now that those are complete, I can begin adding the brighter white outer edge to the fins, just like the tail. Once the markings on the fins start looking symmetrical, I can take out my dark brown wool again and start creating that gradient, same as the tail. Taking out my gray wool yet again, I can start working on a shark's most recognizable feature, which would be their top dorsal fin. As you can probably tell, I did my fin research from here on out, but it's basically the same process as the pectoral fins and the tail, where I just mark a little outline and then create the fin, adding more if it's too thin and whatnot. Once that's complete, I take out my gray wool yet again, and now I can get to work on the pelvic fins. Now that they're done, I go ahead and pick them up and then press them against each other so I can make sure that they're symmetrical. Grabbing my gray wool, setting it out on my needle felting mat, yet again I will poke out a little shape for the next fin, which will be one I don't think I can say on YouTube, I don't know. Basically the scientific name for booty hole and then fin. Sorry, I'm literally a 5-year-old. Moving on to the secondary dorsal fin, which is the smaller one right behind the primary one, I pull out my stencil because smaller needle felt creations have a harder time actually keeping shape, so I use this as a guide so that I don't lose the shape. As you can see, I'm just using the tail of a little chicken stencil so that I can just have that top part which looked like a fin to me. Now that that's done, I grab my bright white wool again and get started on the edge of the dorsal fin. Continuing the process, I add that same white edge to the pelvic fins. And then I do the same thing to the fin that I'm not gonna say. With all of those steps completed for those fins, I can now take out my dark brown wool again and add that gradient to all of them, but we will be starting with the dorsal fin. Then we move on to the secondary dorsal fin, which doesn't have the white outline actually, so this was easier than the other ones. Moving on, we add the gradient to the fin that shall not be named. And last but not least, I add it to the pelvic fins. Now we're ready to assemble the pieces. To do this, I push in a basic needle that is attached to the tail into the base of the tail on the body so that it holds it while I go in with my bigger felting needle to connect the pieces. Once they're connected, you can just take out the normal needle and it's done. Now I just continue to do this process for all of the limbs/fins. You don't actually need a normal needle to attach two pieces together, but I find it's a lot easier because it keeps it in place. Because if you do it without a needle, it tends to slide around and you don't always get that perfect connection, so that's why I do it. Now I will just let you enjoy my epic royalty-free music until we are on to the next step. Now that the fins are attached, it is time to smooth out the connections and cover up any small mistakes that may have been made along the way. This helps the fins look like they are actually one coherent piece as part of the body instead of just attached on one by one. Once the connections have been smoothed on the top with gray wool, I take out my white wool and smooth the connections on the belly. You can't really see this in any of the pictures later on, but it's just a nice touch that I like to add. Moving on to the head and face. Using my finest tipped needle, I go in with a thin strip of dark brown wool and start poking in the gills. This leaves a long strip of wool behind, so I just snip it off with my small wool shears so that I can use it again for the other gills. Using the same steps, I finish the gills on the other side as well. Using the same process I used for the gills, I make the nostrils. Once I'm certain they're symmetrical, I can move on to the eyes. Grabbing a small tuft of black wool, I grab my medium-tipped felting needle and start poking the eyes into place. After felting them a bit, the eyes look smooth, and I can now do the same thing to the other side. Taking another small tuft of black wool, we can begin adding the lashes to yassify the shark. Same as the eyes, once the eyelash is looking smooth, we can girl boss our way to the other side. Now that she's looking adequately slay, I grab my red wool and begin needle felting her a mouth. Off camera, I grabbed my brighter white wool again and needle felted her some fierce looking teeth. Taking a small amount of red wool, I started to needle felt in her little blushy cheeks. Once the blush looks symmetrical, we can move on to the final step. Grabbing my small wool shears, I start to snip away all the stray hairs surrounding the shark's body. This isn't a necessity, in fact I forget it a lot of the times, but it helps it achieve a more professional, finished look. Now that she's done, we can take the glamour shots.